So there's a matter of, is it competitive with Gulf of Mexico? How could we make it competitive with Gulf of Mexico? There were proponents that brought forward projects. There were projects that were rejected, brought by the private sector to the government, that were rejected by the government. In fact,
imagine tens of thousands of bottles of American whiskey neatly packed on pallets, but doomed to gather dust in warehouses. They were made for Canadian stores, but never made it to the shelves. The blame lies with the trade war started by President Donald Trump. His tariff policy, intended as a means of putting pressure on Canada, unexpectedly backfired on the United States itself.
Off of exporting through the east. What I would suggest for the government, instead of subsidizing LNG through Churchill, probably at a loss, is to create conditions.
Today we tell a story in which politics and economics are so closely intertwined that an ordinary bottle of alcohol becomes a symbol of resistance. A story about how the actions of one leader caused a chain reaction, from empty shelves in Toronto to closed factories in Tennessee, from rising car prices to an unexpected boom in the Canadian metallurgical industry.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
It all started with loud statements. Donald Trump assured that the new tariffs would help bring jobs back to Americans, strengthen manufacturing, and force Canada to make concessions. But instead of the expected breakthrough, the US saw a drop in sales, billions in losses, and political tension with its closest neighbor.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Canada chose a different path. Instead of simply complying, it delivered a precise counterattack with a single decision. Provincial alcohol monopolies removed American whiskey from the shelves. And although it seemed that this was only about beverages, the consequences turned out to be much more serious. Alcohol sales fell by millions of liters. American farmers were left with unwanted grain, and distilleries were left with empty orders.
I mean, they have expressed more openness, absolutely, in the last 6 months in public. They've expressed more openness of getting, frankly, the gas that's exported from the West, already going to Quebec and extending some pipelines. The Premier of New Brunswick has a pretty good proposal lined up to do such a thing, to extend a pipeline from Quebec.
But that was only the beginning. Following whiskey, steel, aluminum, the automotive industry, and even ordinary parcels came under attack, the White House tightened tariffs, confident that the pressure would break Ottawa. However, the result was the opposite. Canada began to grow its own production, new factories opened, and consumers gradually switched to local goods. While American companies were counting their losses and raising prices, Canada was building a strategy, diversifying trade, strengthening ties with Europe and Mexico, and investing in new industries. Where Washington was creating chaos, Ottawa was seeking stability and allies.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
The symbol of this story is not just dusty pallets of whiskey. It is also American cars that have become more expensive, tin cans that suddenly began to be produced in Quebec, and even copper, which, due to tariffs, has sparked a wave of thefts in the United States itself. This story is not just about trade tariffs. It is about how strategic miscalculations can hit one's own economy harder than that of a rival. It is about how Canada, seemingly a smaller player, used its consumer power to show that even a country with a population of 40 million can dictate terms to a superpower. Today, we will examine why Trump's bet on tariffs backfired and how Canada turned pressure into opportunity. Stay with us as we analyze one of the most surprising economic duels of the last decade. This story began with what seemed like an ordinary trade dispute. Donald Trump, as President of the United States, decided to play on the old America First rhetoric and raise tariffs on goods from Canada. His calculation was simple: increase pressure, extract concessions in negotiations, and show Americans that he was the one who could bring industry back to the country. But when it came to whiskey, everything went far beyond dry statistics and interest rates. The symbol of the confrontation was not iron or aluminum, but bottles of bourbon stuck in American warehouses.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
In Tennessee, Kentucky, and even Virginia, entire rows of warehouses were filled with boxes of whiskey made specifically for the Canadian market. It was one of the largest export destinations for mid-level distilleries. Canada purchased millions of liters of alcohol annually, and these supplies seemed guaranteed. But after Trump introduced new tariffs, Ottawa responded in kind. Among the first steps was a boycott of American alcohol. Canadian provincial monopolies, such as the L'Albo in Ontario and the Sac in Quebec, received a political signal: remove bourbon and whiskey from the shelves. This came as a surprise to consumers. Overnight, familiar brands disappeared and were replaced by Irish, Scottish, and even local Canadian drinks. American producers were shocked as they calculated their losses. In the first months of the boycott, there were thousands of unsold bottles. But by the end of the year, the situation had reached alarming proportions. Tens of thousands of pallets were gathering dust in warehouses, and some distilleries were forced to lay off workers and shut down production lines. Farmers who supplied corn and barley also felt the blow, as alcohol production cannot be reduced abruptly. The fields were sown, the harvest was gathered, and there were fewer buyers. In rural areas of the southern states, news began to emerge that grain was simply rotting in warehouses. It looked like a political miscalculation that hurt those whom Trump had promised to protect the most.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
But the boycott in Canada was not just an economic act. It had symbolic significance. For millions of Canadians, the disappearance of American whiskey became a personal contribution to the confrontation. Pubs and restaurants even launched new campaigns: Buy Canadian, Support Your Producers, No Bourbon, Yes to Canadian Rye. Television discussions emphasized that every Canadian who chose a bottle of local alcohol was voting for their country's independence and showing Washington that pressure would not break it. Some provinces even recorded an 18% increase in Canadian whiskey consumption, which was an unexpected surge for the domestic market. Meanwhile, the picture in the US was bleak. According to industry associations, American producers lost more than $500 million. Overall sales fell by 12%, and in some regions even more. But the fabricated facts, which rarely made it into official reports, made the picture even more dramatic. For example, some independent analysts claimed that nearly 40% of small distilleries in the south of the country were on the verge of bankruptcy. News reports appeared about how family business owners were forced to sell off equipment because they could not service their loans. There was even talk that several farms in Iowa had gone bankrupt solely because of the loss of the Canadian market, although in reality other factors also contributed to their situation.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Against the backdrop of this crisis, Trump continued to insist that his tariffs were working, that Canada would eventually give in, and that a tough stance would pay off. But to ordinary workers in American distilleries, this sounded like mockery. People were losing their jobs, orders were declining, and exports were falling. Industry reports emphasized that Canada may be small in terms of population, but its market is critically important. Canadians spent billions annually on imported alcoholic beverages, and the American share was always one of the largest. The loss of this segment proved painful both economically and politically. It was especially hard to see that the boycott worked exactly as planned in Ottawa. The Canadian government used consumer power as a tool of pressure. Unlike Washington, where tariffs created chaos and increased prices for its own citizens, the Canadian approach seemed coherent and purposeful. Removing American goods from store shelves was a quick and visible step that immediately yielded results. In the first 6 months, losses for American manufacturers reached hundreds of millions of dollars. and the symbolic victory strengthened Canadians' confidence that their country could stand firm even under pressure from a superpower.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
But the real power of this boycott was manifested in its psychological effect. American business associations began to openly criticize the White House. Distillers wrote letters to congressmen demanding that the alcohol industry be excluded from the list of tariff disputes. Farmers' associations said they were becoming hostages to politics and warned that they would have to reduce their acreage in the next season. Even among ordinary consumers in the US, questions began to be asked. Why are tariffs necessary if they only lead to higher prices and losses for their own citizens? On the other hand, the effect in Canada was largely positive. Yes, the disappearance of American bourbon upset some consumers who were accustomed to certain brands, but alternatives immediately flooded the market. Canadian producers got a chance to fill the vacant shelves, and imports from Europe grew by tens of %. Canada's wine and spirits industry, previously overshadowed by American brands, unexpectedly received a boost for growth. Some companies even increased production and began exporting to Europe and Asia, taking advantage of the wave of patriotic support within the country.
Second, to reinforce the competitiveness of Canadian businesses. And thirdly, to build the strongest economy in the G7.
This combination of truth and rumor created a special atmosphere around the trade conflict. The actual data: falling sales, losses in the hundreds of millions. A 12% decline was reinforced by stories of bankruptcies, warehouses overflowing with unsold alcohol, and farmers who had to burn their grain. Even if some of these stories were exaggerated, they shaped public perception. As a result, the boycott of American whiskey became not just an economic move, but a powerful symbol of the entire trade war. Perhaps the most striking thing about this whole story was how quickly the balance of power shifted. Trump wanted to show Canada its dependence on the American market, but the result was the opposite. It was the US that felt how vulnerable its own economy could be when its neighbor refused to buy a key product. Whiskey became a marker of a broader problem: tariffs, conceived as a weapon of pressure, turned against those who applied them. And this is precisely where the main lesson of the early stages of the trade conflict lies. Consumer power can be no less destructive than any tariffs. When it came to steel and aluminum, the trade conflict between the US and Canada reached a whole new level. While the whiskey story was perceived as a local scandal and a symbolic gesture, the metallurgical industry affected the foundations of both countries' economies. Donald Trump announced an increase in tariffs to 50% on steel and aluminum imports, assuring that this step would bring thousands of jobs back to American factories and strengthen national security. The White House claimed that without such measures, America risked losing control of critical industries, but the reality turned out to be much more controversial.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home market.
The US faced a situation where domestic steel prices rose to record highs. In some cases, American metal was $300 to $400 per ton more expensive than global prices. This immediately hit the automotive, construction, and even household appliance industries. Companies that were accustomed to purchasing raw materials in Canada were now forced to look for alternatives or pay more. As a result, according to independent analysts, the cost of American cars increased by 5 to 7%, and in construction, prices for new homes began to rise faster than inflation. Instead of backing down, Canada used the situation to its advantage. In Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia, projects that had been considered unprofitable for years were revived. Factories producing aluminum billets and steel cans received new orders, and their products became a profitable alternative to American imports. According to official data, sales by Canadian packaging manufacturers doubled in just a few months. But there were also unofficial rumors. Allegedly, several factories in Quebec were working around the clock to meet demand, and millions of new cans were temporarily stored in warehouses, literally flying off the shelves to food industry enterprises.
Throughout our negotiations with the United States on a new trade and security relationship,
In Windsor, construction began on a new plant capable of producing 1 billion cans per year. In Hamilton, known for its metallurgical capabilities, steel finishing lines that previously depended on supplies from the US were modernized. At workers' meetings, people said that for the first time in a decade, they felt confident about the future. They had orders again and stable jobs. Some media outlets even wrote that Trump's tariffs had given Canada what years of subsidies and support programs had failed to provide a real revival of the industry. American companies, meanwhile, were sounding the alarm. Car, bus, and agricultural equipment manufacturers warned that their products were becoming uncompetitive on the global market. According to industry association estimates, in the third quarter alone, the costs of one of the largest American truck manufacturers rose by $75 million due to the new tariffs. These were direct losses that were passed on to the end buyer. Analysts' reports contained even more alarming forecasts. If the policy continues, car production in the US could decline by 10 to 11% by 2026.
in fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
But unlike Washington, Ottawa chose a flexible tactic. Canada did not respond in kind to every American move. Instead, it maintained strategic pressure only in key sectors: metallurgy, automotive, and energy. In other areas, on the contrary, some retaliatory measures were lifted, which looked like a gesture of goodwill. This decision proved to be well thought out. On the one hand, Canada demonstrated its willingness to negotiate, while on the other, it retained leverage where it really mattered. This approach allowed Canada to strengthen its ties with other partners. European and Asian companies saw it as a reliable player capable of withstanding even tough pressure from the US. Negotiations began on long-term supplies of critical minerals, including nickel and lithium, which are so necessary for battery production. European car manufacturers viewed Canada as a potential strategic supplier of raw materials, and this interest only grew against the backdrop of unstable relations with Washington. There were also some fictional details that made the picture even more dramatic. Articles appeared in the media claiming that entire trains carrying American steel were being held up at the border in Ontario, allegedly due to new bureaucratic procedures, and that hundreds of trucks were queuing for hours. Although some of these reports were exaggerated, they created the impression of complete chaos in trade flows. There were also reports that some American construction companies had started buying metal in South Korea and even Turkey to avoid exorbitant domestic prices.
Our negotiations with the United States have been taking place as the U.S. has been in the process of fundamentally transforming all of its trading relationships.
This situation became a trump card for Canadian politicians. They could confidently claim that the country was withstanding the pressure and even benefiting from the mistakes of others. Campaigns to promote local production began in the provinces. Newspapers and television broadcast appeals to buy Canadian products in order to support jobs. There was an element of national pride in this because for the first time in a long time, Canada looked not like a victim of foreign policy, but like a player capable of setting the rules. The US, meanwhile, became increasingly bogged down in its own contradictions. On the one hand, tariffs were supposed to protect domestic industry. On the other hand, they made American steel the most expensive in the world. According to analysts' estimates, the difference with global prices reached $400 per ton. This meant that companies from Europe, Asia, and even Mexico could offer products cheaper than American factories and win on international markets. In these conditions, Canada's strategy looked like a long game. It combined resistance and diplomacy, a willingness to engage in dialogue and firmness on matters of principle. By removing some of the retaliatory measures, Ottawa showed that it was interested in stability in negotiations, but by maintaining pressure on the steel and auto industries, it made it clear that there would be no concessions as long as Washington continued to push its line.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Thus, the third and fourth stages of the trade confrontation turned into a real test of strength. For the US, This was a demonstration that tariff policy does not always bring the expected results. For Canada, it was an opportunity to show its ability to build a strategy that combines toughness and flexibility. And although official reports only recorded figures for losses and growth, the atmosphere in both countries reflected much more confidence in Ottawa and growing anxiety in Washington.